the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. In this episode, we will be continuing the discussion on what our podcast title is all about, energy and carbon. However, we will focus on a business strategy approach. Key points in this episode include energy and carbon business strategies, who from your organization should be included, and why an energy and carbon strategy is crucial to meeting your company's goals. Welcome back, Dave and John. How are we feeling about this week's episode on business, energy, and carbon strategies?
Stoked, Lysandra. I am stoked.
That's great. Let's kick this week's episode off with one word that encompasses what an energy and carbon strategy should be for a business. John, I'll start with you.
Yeah, we should have more control over you because this is a totally evil question. But I'm going to go with it, and it is really difficult to come down to it. But the word I'm going to use, it should be proactive.
And my word, Lysandra, is risk management.
Okay. Oh, that's two words. I asked for one.
I know. I had to put that both. That's why I wanted to have a little fun with this. I couldn't.
Okay, that's great. That actually bounces off each other quite well. So risk and then being proactive towards that risk. And I think that's a great way to kind of kick this episode right off. So now that we got those hard hitters out of the way, last episode we ended off with the topic of an energy and carbon strategy. Explain what an energy and carbon strategy is in a business.
So I'll lay in the sort of the strategy, and as we indicated, I think in our last podcast, that you do have a different mindset, meaning energy is sort of instantaneous, in a year. Carbon, you're looking at it further out. But I'll deal with the energy piece, and ultimately where I want to go is it's a strategy related to energy that should fit with the organization's strategic plan. That's not done very often. It's normally seen as a separate silo, but we encourage our customers to think about how their organization is changing, how it's growing, and how energy, whether it's purchasing energy or increasing the efficiency, how that should change based on their business plan and the businesses that they're in and the customers that they serve. And so it should encompass dual purposes, supply and efficiency. It shouldn't be done in a silo or separate from each other. And quite frankly, the other scenario that is very important is they need to have access to data to develop the strategy and then also confirm when they've taken action. But those would be the ingredients that I think are essential. Again, strategy relates to senior management being involved, and it should not be a one department or a one person strategy. This should be developed in cooperation with finance people, to the procurement people, to the operations people, engineering, things of that nature. So it should be a thought process that incorporates it to ensure other people benefit in their position when they're going forward.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different view, but complementary view, I think, on that. And one of the things is that we are very, very familiar with strategic planning in business anyway. A classic approach is the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. We don't often see people actually taking that approach to energy and carbon. And in fact, you should, because it is another aspect of the business. And again, I think where the carbon goes slightly away from the energy. I mentioned in the last podcast that you might want to change the products that you're making in order to meet the requirements of a low carbon economy. Well, if you're going to be doing that, that means you've got to involve product development, sales and marketing, and other people like that as being part of the strategy. No longer can it just be something that's in the back and it is hidden away. It has to become part of the ethos of the business. And I think it's quite interesting that what we've got is probably within an organization, those people that are good at strategic planning don't understand energy and carbon, and those people that understand energy and carbon don't understand strategic planning. So we need to get those sort of disciplines and thinking together. That way, that's how you can be a company or an organization that's a leader and ahead of this curve rather than being playing catch up.
And as John talks, I was thinking another thing that is not done in certainly the energy front is most organizations, when they take action, they actually don't measure the implication of when they took the action and report back whether it was a positive or negative experience. And so I think that's one reason why most organizations don't look at energy, because they're not measuring the impact or the effectiveness. So I think that will be a critical point in strategy, is having a way of measuring what you've done and feeding that back to all the players involved in that as well, including the executives, because they've been told many times before within their organizations they've taken action, but I don't know if anyone actually measures the net result of that action. And I think that's really important. If you want the executives involved, you need to demonstrate the value proposition for them to participate and why they should be involved.
That was well said. However, this does seem like something a company sends one representative to kind of undertake this all. How do businesses make this more manageable? Dave, you briefly touched on this. Who from the organization needs to be involved in an energy and carbon strategy, and why is it important that more than one person is in charge?
Well, I think we've alluded in our conversations that it's so important to have a variety of people. Everyone, whether you're in HR, whether you're in operations, purchasing, whatever, everyone is impacted how they use energy. And so certainly they play a role on what can be done, what should be done, and what isn't done. And we find when you have one person, and this person may be brilliant, they don't have the capacity to know all the depth of the subject matter. They may not have the credibility or the ability of talking to different departments and getting them to act and execute. So we find one person, it might have some value for them being champions to facilitate it, but for them to be the actual manager, a lot of times when people see them as the manager, the energy manager, that means that they do all the work and other people just sit back and don't do it. So you need a variety of people to be involved to ensure that this thing actually is executed. You get proper input, and so things are implemented and not rely on one person. And one last thing on the one person side, we see this frequently where one person goes in and they mean well, they try to do the best they can, but their shelf life tends to be 3 years. There's exceptions, but 3 years or less. And so when they leave, then everything falls down, if there was anything to fall down from. So that's why you should have more than one person. I'm sure John has something that he wants to add on that.
Yeah, I think Dave and I have talked about this before, and that there has been this program to embed energy managers in organizations, and we speak out against it. And I think we have to be clear in this podcast, we're not speaking out against the individuals who are energy managers, because these guys can often be very skilled, very capable, but what it does is it tends to make an energy silo in the business, and that is definitely not the way to go. I was thinking about this and thinking, just look at human resources, because energy is a resource. Human resources. Do we expect the human resources manager to do everything that's required in managing the human resources? No, we don't. We expect them to be the centre for knowledge and guidance, but each line manager and each person under that line manager has the responsibility for managing the human resources that they've got. It should be exactly the same for energy. It should become part of everybody's job. By integrating it and making it part of everybody's job, it's less work overall. The hitch with this is it's a bit more work at the beginning to set this up, but once you set it up, you can embed it, you can make it procedure, and it works well. And going back to Dave's end of 3-year term for somebody, if they have not set up proper procedures and processes within the company, the minute they're out the door, it falls apart. Now, that's where management systems and things like that can certainly help, but they have to be the right systems, and they have to be right for the business that they're in, and they have to be integrated.
Yeah, and coming back to your initial question too, Sandra, who should be involved? I actually think a really important ingredient is the person has the interest and the passion in the subject matter, because it's not an easy topic to deal with. In fact, most people want to run away from it because it's deemed complicated or difficult to deal with. So you need someone who has an interest and passion in the subject. There are different roles. For example, accounting, I believe, could be a lot more involved in helping measure and verify results, feeding that back to the executive when they've taken action, the net benefit it provided. Operations people, they tend to think when you're looking at energy, that's going to impact their KPIs, which would be production output. They think you're going to mess with them. In actual fact, you're actually enhancing. You're going to increase the reliability of equipment, so there'll be less shutdown time. Maintenance people, they're secret weapons. They know all these opportunities in the organizations to fix things. They're kind of the MacGyvers. They may not be given the tools to explain the value of taking things and the cost benefit. So I could go through the whole organization and lay out what roles different people play, because they do play a role. And so certainly our view, it's everyone in their current jobs can play a critical role in managing energy, and that shouldn't be one person's position to take that on all by themselves.
All great points, Dave. Thank you. And John, going back to what you mentioned, you said that this is a bit difficult to start up. So how do businesses make this team happen? How should the executives or managers begin to approach this?
I think you've got to look at what the problems and issues are. And when you one of the things, and Dave has touched on this already, and that is literacy. Energy and carbon literacy is required so that people know the topic that they're talking about. I'm going to go off just slightly off course here, but I've had the thing, before there was COVID, we used to go to things called dinner parties. Apparently we were allowed in other people's houses to eat and things like that. And I would go to somewhere like that, and somebody wouldn't know what I was doing for a living, and they'd start talking about windmills or climate change and everything else like that. And it's quite surprising how many misconceptions that there are out there. So I think we need education, and the education actually needs to start at the top, because if we're talking about carbon in particular, we've got to be strategic, and we've got to look at how the business goes. If you haven't got the C-suite understanding what this is about, they're not going to allocate the time, the resources, the responsibility for it to happen. And in fact, what we know is that these are probably some of the larger hurdles in a company. Not being seen as an important activity. Therefore, somebody isn't given the time to do it. It's not a priority. It's the thing that's always at the bottom of their to-do list, and they never get to the end of the to-do list and they never do it. So it needs to be made an appropriate priority. And one of the ways of doing that is looking at what is the impact of energy and carbon on the business, and then saying, well, if it's got that amount of impact on the business, do we put the right amount of management effort in to address that topic? Yeah. The other thing is start small and build up, and celebrate successes as you go forward.
Yeah, it's really critical. John and I were doing some work in Alberta, and we were describing a program, and we were trying to explain reasons why people should focus on energy. And we used the example of, and John touched upon it before, but if your labor costs are 50% of your product, really in an organization, how much time and money do you spend to make sure your labor is properly skilled and motivated and things of that nature? And you'll find that, companies can spend 10 to 20% of their labor costs just on managing the organization. And then we use the same philosophy. Okay, so you spend, $10 million a year on your utilities. How much money do you spend in managing the utility? And you might be surprised that very few people spend very much time and focus on energy. And that's just an indication of where there's an opportunity for them to do that. I did want to ask, because Lysandra, you're well versed, well educated. I'm curious if you could share with John and I your experience in the university field of what is being addressed in the education front. Can you share with us sort of your knowledge on what's being done to educate people on the energy and carbon markets?
Yeah, and I think this is something a lot of listeners can kind of resonate with. Unfortunately, energy and carbon is kind of something you learn when you actually get into the workplace. So, I mean, in academia, you can learn about different pieces about it, but the actual application doesn't really come together until you're in a workplace and you can kind of see where all the components come in. I do think that this is something that should shift. I mean, you both have touched upon that every single department needs to be, involved with energy and involved with carbon. Well, let's start integrating that into the classroom. When a business major graduates, they need to be aware of that. When an HR major graduates, they need to be aware of that. And I think that's kind of a whole big culture shift that we need to have to, reach these 2050 targets and be more sustainable overall.
Yeah, I totally agree.
A bit of an obvious question, but we have been discussing an energy and carbon plan. Being more direct, can you list what is included in this plan?
I wonder if we've got time to actually cover that in the detail that it needs to be. But it's got to include a range of things. You keep hearing us talk about it. It's got to include something about data collection and data analysis and handling that. Because like any management activity, if you've not got data, not making informed decisions. I think it needs to include roles and responsibilities. It needs to have a vision. It needs to understand programs. It's got to be looking to integrate how it locks in. It's got to look at what systems and standards and things that are out there that perhaps could be deployed and be used. It's got to be forward looking.
I'm going to add, when John talks, it always stirs my thought process. I think data is really critical, but you need that data to establish your baseline. You need to establish where your current starting point is. It would be great for organizations to do a self-evaluation on how effective they think they are currently in managing energy. And I'm saying that with the variety of disciplines being involved, where do they think they are versus some consultant telling them. Exploring that, self-exploring is really important. And then ultimately laying out an implementation plan that actually works for them based on their business requirements, and setting targets will be really important. And then getting the executive, the board, key stakeholders signing off on the plan to ensure that this isn't just a document on paper that no one's actually going to execute. So those would be critical elements, in my view, required in the carbon and energy plan.
Well, we discussed quite a few points today. So similar to starting off with one word, I'm being a bit more lenient and allowing you to rein this in with one final thought for our listeners. What is the greatest takeaway you have for businesses on getting a strategic energy and carbon plan together?
I think John's mentioned in the past, but I'll say this: just get started and start small. Don't get bogged down with all the detail. That there's a lot of stuff coming and people get confused and there's paralysis. So just starting with little pieces, that's what I would do.
I've got to agree with Dave. And in fact, I thought if I was going to answer first, I was going to say, start doing something. And I think, as Dave said, that I would add to it, but don't forget, if we're talking about carbon planning, you need to have that future vision as well. And that's not the detailed route map, but it's where are we heading? So that when you're doing your small steps, you know that they're taking you in the right direction.
Well, a great takeaway. I think our listeners have a lot to think about regarding energy and carbon strategies after today's episode. Thank you both for your time today, Dave and John. I look forward to our next energy and carbon talk next week.
Yes, so do I.
Thanks so much, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune into our podcast on Apple Music and Spotify by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. See you next week.